special report on the Supreme Court's landmark decision regarding presidential immunity. In a 6-3 decision, the court holds that a former president has absolute immunity for core constitutional powers, but no immunity for unofficial acts. We have team coverage this morning. Here with me in studio, we have Spectrum News political director Bob Hart. I'm also joined by constitutional law professor from Campbell University, Gregory Wallace. And at the Supreme Court, Spectrum News Washington, D.C. reporters Angie Gonzalez and Cassie Semyon. Cassie, let's begin with you. Give us the details of this decision.
Yeah, so the question before the court in this case was whether or not a president was able to be immune from prosecution when it came to official and unofficial acts. In a 6-3 decision led by Chief Justice John Roberts, he said that a president does enjoy immunity for official acts, but not for unofficial acts. He wrote in part that although we identified several considerations pertinent to classifying those allegations and determining whether they are subject to immunity, the analysis ultimately comes best left to the lower courts to perform in the first instance. So what happens now is this case will return to the lower courts to decide whether or not the charges that Trump is facing in federal court fall under official or unofficial acts. Special counsel Jack Smith has said that Trump specifically, these acts he's charged with, including obstruction and conspiracy to defraud the United States, those fall under unofficial acts. It will now be up to Judge Tanya Chutkan to decide whether or not that is true and if this case can move forward. And of course, we've been seeing a delay in this case over the last several months because of this case before the Supreme Court. It was the last case heard by the justices. Of course, it's the last decision of the term, and now we will have to wait and see whether or not this case will move forward before Election Day.
All right, Cassie, thank you very much. Let me bring in Professor Gregory Wallace now. Now, Professor, I think the two main things we needed from this ruling was what does this mean for presidential immunity, which I do want to read part of the ruling on that from Justice Roberts. Reading in part, the president enjoys no immunity for his unofficial acts, and not everything the president does is official. The president is not above the law, but under our system of separated powers, the president may not be prosecuted for exercising his core constitutional powers, and he is entitled to at least presumptive immunity from prosecution for his official acts. That immunity applies equally to all occupants of the Oval Office. Professor Wallace, what strikes you about this opinion, and also what does this do for the timeline of the legal proceedings against former President Trump? What happens from here, basically?
One thing I think we have to do is to, if we can, sort of separate the plaintiff in this case, President Trump, from the bigger issue of presidential immunity, and not let our thoughts about one color our thoughts about the other. I think that this is not a surprising decision. I think after listening to oral arguments, most people thought that the Supreme Court would not give what President Trump wanted, which was absolute immunity for everything, and would also not give what the government wanted, which was no immunity for anything. And so I think the court split this down now, absolute immunity for his conversations with other executive branch officials, and then it remanded the case to the district court to determine whether he would have presumptive immunity in his conversations with Vice President Mike Pence, and then everybody else who was not part of the executive branch, state officials, private parties, to determine whether those were official acts or not.
All right, Professor Wallace, thank you very much. I want to go to our Angie Gonzalez quickly, who is outside at the Supreme Court right now. We're just getting word in already from the former president and the president at this point. What are they saying?
Yeah, so when it comes, Bree, to the former president sending a message on his own social media platform, Truth Social, writing, "Big win for our Constitution and democracy. Proud to be an American." Also getting a statement from the Biden campaign. Today's ruling does not change the facts, so let's be very clear about that. About what happened on January 6th. Donald Trump snapped after he lost the 2020 election and encouraged a mob to overthrow the results of a free and fair election. Trump is already running for president as a convicted felon for the very same reason he sat idly by while a mob violently attacked the Capitol. Bree, we also now know that there is a scheduled press call from the Biden-Harris campaign that is going to be on this very subject in just a short time from now. So it isn't all that unusual that we would get a reaction this quickly from both camps on such a consequential decision, but certainly we've seen in other cases that they might take a little bit longer before they formulate an official statement on something like this. But it seems that they may have been expecting the decision that was handed down by the court today. Bree?
All right, Angie Gonzalez, thank you very much. Let's go to our political director, Bob Hart, now. Opinions already coming in fast and furious from all the parties involved here. The court hasn't taken up the issue of presidential immunity in more than 40 years, and now everybody's weighing in on this new decision. How should we look at this?
I mean, it's uncharted territory. So much of what Donald Trump has done is new political ground, and this is yet another precedent that Trump has set. Like you said, there was a Supreme Court decision in 1982 that decided, that found that presidents are immune from civil suits. But this is the first time we've had
a former... the Nixon era
right,
things.
Exactly, from the Nixon era. This is the first time a former president was charged with a crime, and now this is where we are. I should say that since Trump was a real estate developer, back when he first started in the 1970s in New York City, one of his strategies when there was a legal problem was to go to court and try to delay as long as possible. And this, to me, is a big win politically for Trump, because there's no way that this case is going to be done in 4 months. And so the election will come before this case is resolved, which is a major win, because it takes this really off the political table for Trump between now and November.
And a follow-up question for you on this. This really only affects the election subversion case that's going on right now. It doesn't really affect the other cases that Trump has going on against him.
Right, including the classified documents case in Florida, but that seems to be stuck in quicksand. Again, it will be resolved, but Trump can be very happy. It's extremely unlikely that any of these other cases will be resolved between now and the election. So this is, politically, even if this goes the wrong way eventually for Trump, it'll be long after the election is decided, and that's really what he wants. And just like when he was a real estate developer, buying time, this buys some major time for the former president.
It's worked for him before. I guess it's working for him now in this respect, at least, Bob. Thank you very much. Professor Wallace, I want to ask you a follow-up question to this. This case looks at things a little differently than the case back in 1982 did with presidential immunity. That was more about civil cases, civil immunity versus criminal, where this is more about criminal immunity, correct?
Yes, this is about having a president face charges, criminal charges for acts that he undertook while he was in office, not either before or after he was in office, but these are acts that occurred while he was in office.
All right, thank you, Professor Wallace. Cassie, let me go to you outside the Supreme Court now. Let's look at this through the lens of the court makeup. 3 of these justices are Trump appointees.
Yeah, and those 3 are in with John Roberts on this decision, the liberals dissenting. But it's not surprising, because when we did listen to those 2.5 hours of oral arguments back in April, some of the conservative justices seemed to indicate that they would like to limit when former presidents might be, prosecuted, suggesting the case would go back to the lower courts before it could go to trial, if it did at all. And one thing that I did want to point out that Bob spoke about specifically is that the justices gave the former president a gift here in terms of the length of time it took to get this decision. This was the last case heard in April by the court. It's the last decision. Today is July 1st, meaning there's limited time for the lower court to actually hear this and for this to go to trial before Election Day. So it's really giving the former president, now of course the likely Republican nominee, the expected nominee, a little bit of a break here when it comes to his legal woes. And really, in reality, it will now be up to the lower courts to decide moving forward in the future with these new guidelines from the higher court, what falls into official acts for a president versus unofficial acts, and will have consequences for future presidents, not just the former president, but moving forward into the future, what those guidelines look like for chief executives moving forward.
All right, Cassie, thank you very much. Professor Wallace, I want to ask you about recusals, but before we get to that, I want to read a little bit from Justice Sotomayor's dissent. She, writing in part, orders the Navy SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, immune, organizes a military coup to hold on to power, immune, takes a bribe in exchange for a pardon, immune, immune, immune. What do you think she's saying here? Like, really, we can't have a president immune from everything, correct?
Well, the court didn't actually say that, and I think that Justice Sotomayor, in her dissent, overstates the situation here. I don't think that the president is going to get immunity for some of these things because they would be acting outside his official powers here. But we have to understand that immunity is not something that is foreign to the legal system. There are lots of government officials that have absolute immunity. For example, prosecutors have absolute immunity for how they conduct prosecutions. So I think this is not something that's foreign to our legal system, and something that I think is not, frankly, all that controversial. I think what is more controversial is the view of the three dissenters here who say there should be no immunity at all. So I guess President Obama might be charged with murder for his drone strike on an American citizen in Yemen. President Biden could be charged under the Anti-Deficiency Act criminally for spending money without federal money without congressional authorization. And I don't think that's a road we want to go down.
Let me ask you a follow-up question to that. That you say that, you know, this idea of immunity isn't that foreign. What would be an example of that with prosecutors?
Well, somebody could say, well, a prosecutor charged me without having evidence. Maybe it was malicious prosecution, and so the prosecutor should be charged criminally for malicious prosecution. Prosecutor has absolute immunity for that. Judges have absolute immunity for the decisions that they issue. You can't charge a judge with a criminal act based on his or her ruling in a particular case. And as far as the timing of this case goes, I agree that this does work to President Trump's benefit, but you have to understand that the federal government did not file these charges until late in the game because they wanted these trials to take place in the lead up to the presidential election. So I think you have to consider that as a political move as well.
Yeah, everyone has different timelines, for sure. Another follow-up question for you. I want to ask you about recusals. When does a justice recuse themselves? I mean, we saw it with the Justice Brown Jackson in regards to earlier education decisions. When do they step aside? I mean, I think there's a lot of different murky territory, especially because some of these justices were appointed by Trump.
It has never been understood that a justice that is appointed by a particular president has to step aside when there are lawsuits involving that president. That's just not the way it works. And unless you can show bias, I mean, you could say, okay, well, the conservative justices are biased in favor of President Trump. Well, but the liberal justices are biased against him. I mean, that cuts both ways. So typically, recusal only occurs when a justice has a personal interest, financial or some closely personal interest in a case.
All right, Professor Wallace, thank you. Bob, let me bring you in here now. There's been a fair amount of some controversy surrounding the Supreme Court as of late. Recent polling showing historically low levels of confidence in the court. Does this decision do anything to help or hurt the court right now?
I think it's sort of, everything's already sort of baked in. I don't think it hurts the court anymore. I think there's, among liberals, they feel that it's a conservative court. Conservatives think this is a great court. We saw an interesting ruling last week about the January 6th rioters, where we actually saw a liberal member, Judge Jackson, side with the majority, and a conservative member, Judge Barrett, side with the dissenters about whether or not the January 6th rioters could be charged under a federal law. I should also point out, this is also going to be a very interesting case going back to the lower federal court, because you could easily say that, you know, is this part of Trump's duties? If Trump genuinely believes that the election wasn't fair, his lawyers are going to argue, well, he was just doing his job. Now, the prosecutors are going to say, no, this was basically an organized coup attempt by the former president. So it's going to be an interesting case when it finally gets to the court.
All right, thank you, Bob. If you're just joining us, it is 11 o'clock Eastern time, and we are bringing you a special report on the Supreme Court's landmark decision regarding presidential immunity. Again, in a 6-3 decision, the court holds that a former president has absolute immunity for core constitutional powers, but no immunity for unofficial acts. Of course, now this is going to go down to the lower court again to argue what exactly this means. Let me bring in now our Cassie Semien, who is at the Supreme Court. Cassie, what does this do for the 2024 presidential race?
Well, right now, of course, it's July 1st, which means Election Day is just a few months away. It really limits the time now for the special counsel to try and bring this case to court and have a full trial. It's unlikely at this point. That is, a benefit for former President Donald Trump, that this was the last case released by the Supreme Court. It was the last case heard in late April, last decision of the term. This 6-3 ruling, the question before the court was whether or not, as you mentioned, a president was able to be immune from prosecution for official and unofficial acts. The court ruling with the liberals dissenting that a president only is immune for official acts, not unofficial acts. Special counsel Jack Smith has been arguing that former President Donald Trump, the charges he faces were all unofficial, including conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, as well as conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government. So these cases now are going to go back to the lower court to decide with the guardrails that the Supreme Court has provided whether or not those acts actually were unofficial acts made by former President Donald Trump while in office, and whether or not this case can move forward. But again, that trial was supposed to begin on March 4th, Bree. It's now July 1st, so it's going to be very close timing for the special counsel to actually bring this case if Judge Tanya Chutkan agrees that those acts were unofficial acts committed by former President Donald Trump.
All right, thank you, Cassie. Angie Gonzalez is joining us now, also at the Supreme Court. Angie, let's talk again about reaction coming in from the former president and the president. They're already weighing in on this. Is there more opinions coming in surrounding them as well?
There are, and Bree, most of what we're hearing in terms of reaction beyond what former President Donald Trump has said, which he said that this is a big win for our Constitution and democracy, is some conservative opinions coming from members of Congress. One of them, we of course have Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio. He is saying that this was a decision that was justly sought. He said in his statement released, hyper-partisan prosecutors like Jack Smith cannot weaponize the rule of law to go after the administration's chief political rival, and we hope that the left will stop its attacks on President Trump. Also, looking at a statement that's coming in from the Attorney General of Missouri. He wrote, proud of the work that we've done in this case and so many others to combat the weaponization of the government against President Trump. Again, we're also hearing from the Biden administration that they are focusing on the January 6 charges against the president, of course, the former president, I should say, and saying that this really doesn't change the facts of the case, the decision that we are getting from the Supreme Court today.
All right, Angie, thank you very much. And Bob, I want to quickly go to you. What are the timing of this all? Break this down for us.
Well, next week, the former president is going to be sentenced for his 34 felony convictions. So we should point out not all of his legal headaches are over. He could face a jail sentence or more likely probation. That's the next big legal chapter in a very long legal book that Donald Trump has been writing.
Yeah, and it's been a very interesting time coming right after this debate that's happened between the two, so a lot to be aware of. All right, I want to thank our Cassie Semien and Angie Gonzalez, Professor Gregory Wallace from Campbell University, and Political Director Bob Hart for their incredible analysis of this historic decision by the Supreme Court.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage, and click the subscribe button here. You can also download our app and watch us on TV to learn more about the candidates, where they stand on the issues, and more. We'll see you then.